The first thing Luca Conti noticed was the table, not the crystal glasses, not the soft piano, not the servers moving with perfect timing. The table. His maid was sitting there alone. Grace Harper, calm, polite, always focused, sat in the middle of a luxury restaurant as if she belonged there, hands folded, posture straight, eyes scanning the room one careful glance at a time. Luca stopped walking. His driver had just opened the door behind him, and Luca didn't move. For a second, his bodyguards hesitated too, reading him the way they always did. Grace didn't see him yet. She was wearing a simple black dress that fit her perfectly without trying too hard. Her hair was down, brushed smooth and tucked behind one ear. She looked like she'd been nervous earlier and forced herself into composure. Luca's jaw tightened. He didn't like surprises. He liked control, schedules, and silence. And he definitely didn't like seeing his own employee alone in a place where people came to be watched. He crossed the room without rushing. As he approached, the host's smile widened in recognition. "Mr. Conti, your table is ready." Luca barely nodded. His attention was on Grace. He reached her table and stopped at the edge, close enough that she would feel his presence. Grace looked up. For half a second, her face changed. Not panic, not guilt. Something sharper, like she had been caught in a moment that wasn't meant for him. "Mr. Conti," she said quickly, then corrected herself. "Luca." She always did that lately. Slipped, fixed it, pretended it didn't matter. Luca kept his voice low, steady, and firm. "What are you doing here all by yourself?" Grace blinked once. Then her lips parted like she was about to explain. But she didn't. Instead, she lifted her chin and answered, clear as day. "I'm not alone." Luca's eyes narrowed. He glanced at the empty chair across from her. The place setting was ready. A water glass, untouched. A folded napkin. A menu already opened, as if someone had been here and stepped away. Luca's gaze returned to Grace. "Then where is he?" Grace didn't have time to answer. A man appeared at the table, stepping in from the side with a warm smile and the kind of confidence that came from being liked everywhere he went. "Grace?" he said, then looked at Luca. "Oh, sorry. I didn't realize you had company." Grace stood immediately. "Ethan, this is Luca Conti." The man offered his hand without hesitation. "Ethan Blake, nice to meet you." Luca looked at the hand. Then he looked at Ethan's face. Mid-30s, clean haircut, nice suit. Not flashy, but expensive. The type who smiled first and asked questions later. The type who thought the world was friendly because it usually was. Luca didn't take the hand. He didn't have to. The air itself shifted. The servers nearby slowed down without meaning to. A woman at the next table stopped talking mid-sentence, watching openly now. Grace's eyes flicked to Luca with a quiet warning. "Please don't do this here." Luca finally spoke. "You're on a date." Ethan chuckled softly, like it was normal to have this conversation in front of a stranger who looked like he owned the building. "A blind date, technically. A friend set it up." Grace added quickly, "It's my night off." Luca's gaze went back to her. "Is it?" Grace's cheeks warmed. "Yes." Ethan smiled again, trying to keep things easy. "Grace has been great company so far, even if I'm the one who got lost trying to find the restroom." Grace shot him a look. "You didn't get lost. You walked into a private event and pretended you belonged there." Ethan lifted both hands. "It worked, didn't it? I got directions. And one person called me sir, like I was important." Grace's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Luca noticed. That tiny, almost smile hit him harder than it should have, because Grace didn't laugh much around him. She was respectful, controlled, careful. She saved her softness for private moments when she thought no one was looking, and now she was giving it to someone else. Luca's voice stayed calm, but his words were sharp. "Grace, may I speak with you?" Grace didn't move. "Right now?" "Yes." Ethan glanced between them. "I can step away." "No," Grace said quickly. Then she looked at Luca again, steadying herself. "Whatever you need to say, you can say here." Luca held her gaze. She was drawing a line, in public, in front of another man. Luca leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You didn't tell me. Grace's eyes widened a fraction. Tell you what? That I'm a grown woman with a life. The words were quiet, but they landed. Luca straightened, expression unreadable. He spoke at normal volume again. You should have told Victor where you were. Grace's eyebrows lifted. Victor is not my father. Ethan coughed into his fist to hide a laugh. Grace glanced at Ethan, then back at Luca, looking embarrassed that she'd snapped. I mean, I'm safe. Luca looked at Ethan again. Do you know who I am? Ethan blinked, then smiled politely. I'm guessing you're important. The host almost bowed when you walked in. Luca didn't smile. Grace jumped in, trying to steer it back to normal. Luca is my employer. Ethan's expression shifted into friendly surprise. Oh, you work for him? Grace nodded. I manage his home. Ethan looked impressed. That sounds intense. I can barely manage my laundry. Grace's lips parted in a laugh she tried to hide. It still escaped. Luca watched it happen, and it made his chest feel tight. He didn't like this, not because he wanted to control her, because he didn't understand why the thought of losing her attention felt like something being taken from him. Luca turned slightly, signaling the host with one small motion. The host appeared instantly. Mr. Conti? Luca didn't take his eyes off Grace as he spoke. Add a third chair to my table. Grace stiffened. Luca. Ethan blinked. Your table. Luca finally looked at Ethan again. Join me. Both of you. Ethan hesitated, then smiled awkwardly. I'm not sure this is supposed to be our date. And it will be, Luca said smoothly. At my table. Grace's eyes flashed. You can't just... Yes, I can. Grace inhaled, then lowered her voice. Please don't turn this into a scene. Luca leaned in, close enough for her to smell his cologne. Clean, expensive, restrained. Then don't make me the villain. Come to the table. Grace's throat moved as she swallowed. For a moment, Luca thought she might refuse him. And that scared him more than it should have. Then Grace nodded once, tight and controlled. Fine, but you're going to be normal. Ethan laughed, unable to help it. I'd love to see what normal looks like for him. Grace shot Ethan a look that said, not helping. They moved. Luca walked ahead. Grace followed, and Ethan walked beside her, close enough to offer her his arm again, like they were at a wedding. Grace didn't take it. Luca noticed that too. At the table, the server pulled out Grace's chair. Luca waited until she sat. Then he sat across from her. Ethan sat beside Grace, angled toward her instinctively, as if the two of them were still in their own world. Luca watched Ethan's hand rest on the table near Grace's, not touching, but close. Luca kept his expression calm. Inside, he was doing math he didn't want to do. Grace looked between them, then forced a polite smile. So, Ethan, tell Luca what you do. Ethan brightened. I run a small company. Marketing analytics. Nothing exciting. Grace warned him with her eyes. Ethan corrected fast. Okay, it's exciting to me, but not dinner party exciting. Luca's gaze stayed on Grace. You didn't mention a blind date. Grace's cheeks warmed again. Because it's not your business. Ethan lifted his glass. To Grace's night off. Grace picked up her glass slowly. To my night off. Luca didn't lift his glass. He just looked at Grace and said, quiet and precise, It became my business the moment I saw you sitting alone. Grace's eyes locked onto his. The restaurant seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them, and the fact that Luca Conti was not used to wanting something he couldn't order. Grace's voice came out soft, careful. I wasn't alone. Luca's gaze flicked to Ethan for half a second, then returned to her. You will be when he leaves. Ethan choked on his water. Grace's eyes widened. Luca! Ethan coughed, laughing now. Wow, okay. This is... direct. Grace leaned closer to Luca, voice low and urgent. You're not doing this. Luca leaned in too, matching her tone. Then tell me why you're here. Grace froze. Because the truth was simple. and she didn't want to say it out loud in front of Ethan. She was here because she wanted to be wanted by someone who didn't own her schedule. She was here because she wanted to feel like a woman, not a maid walking through marble hallways, always careful, always quiet. She was here because Luca Conti made her feel too much, and she didn't know what to do with it. Grace sat back slowly. Her voice turned steady again. I'm here because I said yes to one normal thing. Luca stared at her. Then, with no smile and no warmth, he said, Normal is not safe. Grace's eyes flashed. I don't need you to scare me into obedience. Ethan looked between them again, then tried to lighten the moment. For the record, I'm very safe. I recycle. I call my mom. I cried during a dog movie last week. Grace actually laughed this time. Luca didn't, but his eyes softened for half a second when Grace laughed, and she felt it. That tiny crack in his control. Grace looked down at her napkin, then back up. Can we just eat? Luca's voice lowered. We will. Then he added, calm but loaded. And afterward you and I are going to talk. Grace held his gaze. Her heart beat harder, because she didn't know if she wanted to run from that talk or lean into it. And as the first course arrived and Ethan started telling a story that made Grace smile again, Luca sat across from her with the kind of patience that looked like calm but felt like a warning. Because Luca Conti had decided something the moment he saw Grace at that table, and Grace had no idea what he was planning. Not yet. And the question hanging in the air was simple. What exactly did Luca decide, and how far would he go to pull Grace back into his world? Grace barely tasted the food, not because it wasn't perfect, it was. The restaurant served everything at the exact temperature it should be, with servers who somehow appeared the second. A glass was half empty. Grace barely tasted it because Luca kept looking at her like he was memorizing her face. Ethan kept talking, trying to keep the mood light. So I show up at the wrong building, Ethan said, grinning, and the doorman says, Sir, this is a private event. And I said, confidently, Yes, I know. Grace covered her smile with her napkin. You did not. I did, Ethan insisted. Then I walked in like I belonged there. I nodded at people. I pretended I was late. Grace shook her head, amused. That's terrible. It's a skill, Ethan said. I think it's how half the city survives. Luca's voice cut in smoothly. It's also how people get into places they don't belong. Ethan blinked at Luca, still smiling, but careful now. Fair, but I wasn't trying to get into anything dangerous. I was trying to find a restroom. Luca didn't look at Ethan. He looked at Grace. You trust him? Grace stiffened. I don't trust him. I met him an hour ago. Luca's eyebrow lifted. And you're still sitting here. Grace met his gaze. Because you forced the situation. Luca didn't deny it. Because you let yourself be alone. Grace's voice stayed calm, but her fingers tightened around her fork. I told you I'm not alone. Luca's eyes flicked toward Ethan again, then back. That doesn't answer my question. Grace took a slow breath. She could feel people glancing over occasionally, drawn by Luca's presence and the tension that didn't match the soft music. She leaned slightly forward and lowered her voice. Luca, please. You're making this uncomfortable. Luca's expression didn't change. Good. Grace's eyes widened. Good? Yes, Luca said quietly. Because you're too comfortable pretending I don't care where you are. Ethan cleared his throat and lifted his hands slightly, as if calming two people arguing over a parking spot. Okay, I'm not trying to be the problem here. Grace turned to Ethan, grateful. You're not. Luca's voice was cool. Then what are you? Ethan held Luca's gaze for the first time, not flinching, but not challenging either. A guy on a blind date, with a woman who seems smart, kind, and, honestly, too good for this tension. Grace's cheeks warmed, Luca's eyes hardened. Watch your tone. Ethan blinked. My tone? Grace exhaled sharply. Luca. Luca's gaze stayed fixed on Ethan. You don't compliment what isn't yours. Grace's stomach dropped. Ethan looked stunned for a second. Then he laughed, short and disbelieving. Wow. You really talk like that. Luca didn't blink. I really do. Grace leaned toward Luca again, voice tight. You're acting like I belong to you. Luca leaned closer too, his voice low enough that it felt private. If you didn't matter to me, I wouldn't be sitting here. Grace froze, because that was the closest Luca had ever come to admitting anything. He always kept it contained. He always spoke in facts and instructions. He didn't speak in feelings. And now he was. Grace sat back, heart pounding. Ethan, sensing the shift, softened his tone. Grace, we can go somewhere else. We don't have to stay. Luca's gaze snapped to Grace. You're leaving? Grace blinked. Ethan offered her a gentle smile. If you want, no pressure. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she put them on her lap, because she did want to leave. But she also didn't want to give Luca the satisfaction of thinking he could show up and control her choices. Grace looked at Luca. I'm not leaving because you want me to. I'm leaving because this is too much. Luca's jaw tightened. You think I'm too much? Grace stood. Right now? Yes. Ethan stood quickly too. Okay, let's go. Luca's chair moved back an inch, not like he was going to stop her physically. He didn't need to. His presence alone made the room feel smaller. Grace picked up her purse. She forced her voice steady. I'll be at the house tomorrow like always. Luca's eyes tracked her. No. Grace paused. No? Luca stood, smooth and controlled. You're coming with me. Ethan's smile vanished. Excuse me? Grace's eyes widened. Luca, you can't. Luca's voice was quiet, but it carried. Grace, don't make me ask twice. Grace felt the room watching again. She hated that he could do that. Keep his voice calm and still make it feel like a command. Grace turned to Ethan, flustered. I'm sorry, this isn't normal. Ethan's expression softened. Hey, it's okay. I don't want to make your life harder. Grace swallowed. I didn't expect. Ethan nodded toward Luca. I can tell. Grace's eyes burned. She wasn't going to cry here, not in front of strangers, not in front of Luca. Ethan took a step back, respectful. Text me if you want to talk when things calm down. Grace nodded quickly. I will. Luca's hand landed lightly at the small of Grace's back, barely touching, but enough to guide her. Grace flinched at the contact, then hated herself for reacting. Because it wasn't rough. It wasn't forced. It was intimate. And that made it worse. They moved through the restaurant. Luca's team fell into place around them, subtle, efficient. Outside, the cold air hit Grace's face, snapping her into sharper awareness. The black car waited at the curb. Grace stopped beside the door. Luca, I'm not a child. You can't just take me. Luca looked down at her, face unreadable. I'm not taking you. I'm bringing you home. Grace's throat tightened. Home? Luca's eyes held hers. You work there. You sleep there. You've been there every day for months. Grace whispered, that's not what home means. For the first time, Luca's expression softened fully, just for a second. Then it vanished again. He opened the car door. Get in, Grace. Grace hesitated. Then she did it, because the sidewalk wasn't a battlefield she wanted to stand on. Inside the car, the silence pressed in. Grace stared out the window as the city moved by, lights reflecting off the glass. Luca spoke after a long moment. Who set up the blind date? Grace didn't look at him. Natalie. Luca's voice stayed calm. Your friend. Yes. You told her you wanted to date. Grace's hands clenched. I told her I wanted to feel normal. Luca's gaze burned into her profile. And you thought going out with a stranger was normal? Grace finally turned to him. Yes, because it's what women do. They meet someone. They talk. They laugh. They see if there's something there. Luca's voice lowered. And was there? Grace's heart skipped. What? Luca leaned slightly closer, eyes locked on hers. Was there something there? Grace's mouth went dry. Because if she said yes, Luca would react. If she said no, She'd be lying. Grace forced a calm tone. Ethan is nice. Luca's jaw tightened. Nice. Grace nodded. Yes. Luca stared at her for a long moment, then looked away, out the opposite window. His voice came out quieter. You deserve more than nice. Grace's breath caught. She stared at him. And Luca didn't look back, like he regretted saying it the moment it left his mouth. The car turned, entering the private drive toward Luca's building. Grace's body tensed. So what now? You tell me I can't go on dates? Luca's voice was controlled again. I tell you that you don't go on blind dates without letting Victor know where you are. Grace snapped. I'm not your property. Luca's gaze sliced back to her. And I'm not your father. I'm the man who pays your salary and keeps you safe. Grace's voice shook with anger. I didn't ask you to keep me safe. Luca leaned in, close enough that Grace could see the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw, the tiredness he hid behind control. Yes, you did. Grace froze. When? Luca's eyes didn't blink. The night you showed up at my door with your suitcase and that stubborn look, saying you needed work and you needed it fast. Grace's throat tightened. That was you asking, Luca said quietly. You just didn't have the words. Grace looked away, swallowing hard. Because it was true. She had been desperate then. Tired. Alone. Trying to survive. And Luca had opened his door. Not out of kindness. She had always assumed it was convenience. He needed someone organized. Someone quiet. But Luca's next words shattered that. I didn't hire you because you were the best resume, he said. Grace's head snapped back to him. What? Luca's voice was steady. I hired you because my mother asked me to. Grace's breath stopped. His mother was gone. Everyone in the building knew it. The staff spoke of her with careful respect. Grace whispered, Your mother didn't know me. Luca's gaze held hers. She knew of you. Grace felt a cold ripple of confusion. How? Luca looked away again, jaw tight. Not in the car, not tonight. Grace's pulse hammered. Luca, what does that mean? The car rolled to a stop. The driver opened the door. Luca stepped out first, then offered Grace his hand. Grace stared at it, stunned. Are you serious right now? Luca's face stayed calm. Grace. The way he said her name made her chest feel tight. Grace finally took his hand. His grip was warm and steady, not squeezing, not forcing. But the moment her fingers touched his, her body reacted. Heat, awareness, that uncomfortable pull. They walked inside. In the elevator, Luca stood too close. Grace could smell him again. Clean, subtle, controlled. She swallowed, voice low. You embarrassed me. Luca's gaze remained forward. I prevented a mistake. Grace's eyes flashed. A mistake would be me thinking you get to decide my life. Luca finally turned his head and looked at her fully, then decide it. Grace blinked. What? Luca's voice dropped, quiet and intense. Decide what you want, because if what you want is a life where I don't matter, say it. Grace's heart slammed. The elevator doors opened. Grace didn't move right away. She stood there, caught between anger and something softer that scared her more. Because the truth was, Luca did matter. Too much. Grace forced herself to walk out. But as she walked toward the penthouse, one thought wouldn't leave her head. If Luca's mother knew of her, then Grace's entire normal life might not be as simple as she thought. And the question was louder now. How did Luca's mother know Grace? And what secret was Luca refusing to say out loud? Grace barely slept. She lay in her bed in the staff wing of the penthouse, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of the restaurant. Luca's eyes on her. Ethan's polite smile. The way Luca's hand had touched her back like it belonged there. And then the words in the car. I hired you because my mother asked me to. Grace rolled onto her side, staring at her phone on the nightstand. Natalie had texted 3 times. Natalie. Are you alive? Natalie. Did you leave with him? Natalie. Grace, please respond before I drive to NYC and start a scene. Grace typed, deleted, typed again. Grace, I'm okay. Please don't drive anywhere. I'll call you tomorrow. She stared at the message for a second, then hit send. A minute later, Natalie, tomorrow is too late. Tell me everything. Grace turned the phone face down. She couldn't tell Natalie everything because Grace didn't even understand it herself. Morning came too fast. Grace forced herself into routine because routine was the only thing that kept her calm. Coffee, laundry schedule, pantry inventory, fresh towels. The penthouse was quiet, clean, controlled, and Luca was already awake. Grace found him in the kitchen, shirt sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, standing at the counter with a laptop open. He looked like he'd been working all night. He didn't look up when she entered. He spoke first. You're late. Grace's eyebrows lifted. It's 7:15. Luca's gaze remained on the screen. You're never late. Grace's throat tightened. Maybe I'm trying new things. That got his attention. Luca lifted his eyes slowly and Grace felt the weight of them immediately. He didn't look angry. He looked focused, like he'd decided something while she slept. Grace kept her voice steady. You said we'd talk. Luca closed his laptop. We are. Grace stepped closer, stopping at a careful distance. Start with your mother. Luca's jaw flexed. I said not tonight. Grace held her ground. It's not tonight anymore. Luca stood, tall and controlled. He moved closer, slowly, intentionally, until Grace's body reacted without permission. Her breath shortened. Her pulse jumped. Luca stopped just short of touching her. His voice came out low. Do you want to quit? Grace blinked, thrown. What? Luca's eyes stayed locked on hers. After last night. Do you want to quit? Grace swallowed. No. Luca didn't move. Do you want to keep working here and pretend nothing happened? Grace hesitated, because she didn't know if she could pretend. Luca watched her face like he was reading every flicker of emotion. Grace forced honesty. I want my life to be mine. Luca nodded once. Good. Grace frowned. Good. Luca's voice stayed calm. Then hear me clearly. I'm not banning you from dating. I'm not deciding your life. Grace stared at him, suspicious. Okay, Luca added. But if you go out with someone you don't know, you tell Victor where you are. Not for me. For you. Grace's chest tightened. I don't want a guard. Luca's gaze hardened slightly. You already have one. Grace's stomach dipped. What? Luca didn't blink. Victor has been watching the staff entrance for months. He watches because I told him to. Grace's face flushed with anger. You had me watched? Luca's voice stayed controlled. I had you protected. Grace snapped. That's the same thing. Luca's expression shifted. Something like regret passed through his eyes. I understand why you're angry. Grace's voice shook. Do you? Because it feels like you're telling me I'm free while holding the leash. Luca didn't respond immediately. He looked at her like he was choosing his words carefully. Then he said, quiet and direct, I didn't do it to control you. I did it because you matter. Grace's breath caught. There it was again. That dangerous honesty. Grace whispered, Why? Luca's jaw flexed. Because you're in my home. Because people see you. Because they look for openings. Grace took a step back, trying to cool her own reaction. You're making it sound like I'm in danger just because I work for you. Luca's voice didn't soften. You are. Grace stared at him, heart pounding. Then why did you hire me? Luca's eyes held hers. Because I couldn't say no. Grace's lips parted. That doesn't make sense. Luca leaned slightly forward, still not touching her. It will. Grace felt her body tremble with frustration and something else she didn't want to name. She shifted topics because she needed air. Ethan texted me. Luca's eyes narrowed. He did. Grace watched Luca carefully. He asked if I'm okay. Luca's voice was flat. You are. Grace raised her eyebrows. You don't get to answer for me. Luca took a slow breath. Then answer. Grace hesitated, then said the truth. I'm not okay. Not because of Ethan. Because you showed up and made it feel like I did something wrong. Luca's gaze stayed steady. I didn't like seeing you there. Grace whispered. Why? Luca didn't answer right away. He looked away for the first time, toward the window, toward the city beyond the glass. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. Because I'm not used to wanting something I can't buy. Grace froze. Her heart hammered so loud she felt it in her throat. Luca turned back to her. That's the truth, and I don't like it. Grace stared at him, breath shallow. So what do you want? Luca stepped closer. This time his hand lifted, slow and deliberate, and he tucked a loose strand of hair behind Grace's ear. His knuckles brushed her skin lightly. Grace's entire body reacted. She didn't pull away. She didn't lean in either. She stood perfectly still, as if movement would break something. Luca's voice was low. I want to take you to dinner. Grace blinked. Not as your employer, Luca said. Not as a forced table arrangement, as a man asking a woman. Grace's lips parted, but no sound came out. Because that was the thing she'd wanted. Normal. But Luca Conti offering normal didn't feel normal. It felt like stepping onto a cliff edge. Grace whispered, I'm your maid. Luca's eyes didn't flinch. You're a woman. Grace's throat tightened. If we do this, it changes everything. Luca nodded once. Yes. Grace swallowed. And Ethan? Luca's gaze sharpened. You're still thinking about him? Grace shook her head quickly. No. I'm thinking about how messy this is. Luca's voice stayed calm. Then keep it simple. Grace whispered. Simple isn't what you do. Luca's mouth twitched, almost a smile. You're right. Grace tried to breathe. What about your mother? Luca's face hardened again. Tonight. Grace pressed. Why can't you just tell me? Luca's voice dropped, serious. Because if I tell you, you might leave. Grace stared at him. That confession landed differently. Not power, not control, fear. Luca Conti was afraid she'd leave. Grace's phone buzzed on the counter behind her. She didn't move to get it. She didn't want to break the moment, but Luca glanced toward the sound anyway. Him. Grace swallowed. Probably. Luca's gaze returned to her. Answer it. Grace blinked. What? Luca's voice stayed steady. Answer it. Tell him whatever you need to tell him. I'm not going to stop you. Grace hesitated, then walked to the counter and picked up her phone. Ethan. Hey. No pressure. Just checking in. Did I mess things up? Grace stared at the text. She didn't want to hurt Ethan. He had been kind. He had been respectful. But she also couldn't pretend that Luca wasn't standing 5 feet away, making her feel like her skin was awake. Grace typed slowly. Grace, you didn't mess anything up. Last night was unexpected. You're a good man. I'm just dealing with something complicated. A second later. Ethan, I figured, if you want to try again, I'm here. If you don't, I'll still be here. No hard feelings. Grace's chest tightened with guilt and gratitude. She looked up. Luca was watching her carefully, like he was letting her choose in real time. Grace swallowed. He's being nice. Luca's voice stayed calm. Good. Grace blinked again. That's it? Luca nodded. I don't hate him. I hate how I felt. Grace's voice came out small. How did you feel? Luca stepped closer again, and this time he didn't stop. His hand slid gently to Grace's waist, warm through the fabric of her sweater. Grace inhaled sharply. Luca's face was close, his eyes locked onto hers. Jealous. Grace's breath caught. He said it like a confession, not an accusation. Grace's hands lifted, hesitated, then landed lightly on his chest, feeling the heat of him through his shirt. Luca didn't move. He let her touch him like it was her choice. Grace whispered, "This is a mistake." Luca's voice was quiet. Then tell me to let go. Grace couldn't. Her fingers tightened slightly on his shirt. Luca's gaze dropped to her lips. Grace's heart hammered. Then Luca stopped himself. He released her waist and stepped back, controlled again, like he was proving something. His voice came out steady. Dinner. Tonight. You choose the place. You choose the time. You choose the rules. Grace stared at him, shaken. Luca turned to leave the kitchen, then paused at the doorway and added, "And Grace?" Grace's breath caught. "What?" Luca looked back, serious. "Victor isn't the only one watching." Grace froze. "Who else?" Luca's voice was quiet. "Someone from my mother's side." Grace's stomach dropped, because that meant the secret wasn't just Luca's. It was bigger, and it had been following her longer than she realized. And the question hit hard. Who else was watching? And what did Luca's mother connect to Grace that could change everything? Grace chose the place, not because she wanted control, because she needed proof that this was real, not just Luca Conti deciding the shape of her life again. She picked a small, quiet restaurant on the Upper West Side. Warm lighting, simple menu, no velvet ropes, no people staring at Luca like he owned the air. Luca arrived exactly on time. No bodyguards inside, no dramatic entrance. Just Luca in a dark coat, hair neat, face calm. When he saw Grace waiting outside, he stopped for half a second and looked at her like he'd been holding his breath all day. Grace tried to look normal. She tried to feel normal. But the second Luca stepped close, her body reacted again. Heat, awareness, that pull she couldn't explain without sounding foolish. Luca held the door open for her. "You picked well." Grace stepped inside. "It's quiet." Luca's mouth twitched slightly. "I can be quiet." Grace shot him a look. "You can be intimidating while quiet." Luca leaned closer, voice low, almost playful. "That's not my fault." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "It kind of is." They sat. No tension this time, not the sharp kind. This tension was different, soft, close, full of things that hadn't happened yet. Luca looked at the menu for 2 seconds, then set it down. "You look beautiful." Grace blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you." Luca's gaze stayed steady. "You don't hear that enough." Grace's throat tightened. "I hear it from Natalie." Luca's eyebrow lifted. "Your friend." Grace nodded. "She tells me I'm pretty and stubborn." Luca nodded once. "She's correct." Grace couldn't stop the small laugh that escaped. Luca watched her laugh like he'd earned it. Grace breathed out slowly, trying to keep herself grounded. "So, rules." Luca leaned back slightly. "Tell me." Grace held his gaze. "You don't ask me about my schedule like I'm being interrogated." Luca nodded. "Okay." Grace continued. "You don't threaten anyone I talk to." Luca's eyes narrowed. "I didn't threaten him." Grace gave him a look that said, "You absolutely did." Luca exhaled through his nose, a quiet sign of surrender. "Fine, I won't." Grace added, "And you don't use my job as leverage." Luca's expression turned serious. "I never would." Grace watched his face, trying to decide if she believed him. Luca's voice came out calm and direct. "If this is real, Grace, then your job stays yours no matter how it ends." Grace's chest tightened. "That's a big promise." Luca nodded. "I don't make small ones." Grace swallowed. "Okay." Luca's gaze softened. "Your turn." Grace blinked. "My turn." Luca's voice stayed steady. "My rule. You don't say yes to something you don't want just because you think I expect it." Grace stared at him. "I wouldn't." Luca's eyes held hers. "You've spent your whole life trying to be easy for people." Grace's throat tightened, surprised. "You don't know my whole life." Luca's voice dropped. "I know enough." Grace's pulse jumped. "From who?" Luca didn't answer. Grace's fingers tightened around her water glass. "Luca." Luca's gaze remained steady. "Tonight isn't about that. Tonight is about us." Grace whispered, There is no us yet. Luca leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on hers. Then let's build it. Grace felt the words land inside her like something heavy and warm. She looked away for a second because she didn't trust her face. The server came, asked if they were ready to order. Grace ordered quickly just to breathe. Luca ordered too, barely looking at the menu, then turned his full attention back to her. So, Luca said quietly, tell me about you, not your work, not what you do for me. Grace hesitated. There isn't much. Luca's eyebrow lifted. I don't believe that. Grace forced honesty. I grew up in Pennsylvania, small town. I came to New York because I needed a fresh start. Luca watched her closely. Family. Grace's stomach tightened. Not close. Luca didn't push immediately. He waited. Grace appreciated that, even though it made her heart ache. Grace continued carefully. I had a messy childhood. I don't like talking about it. Luca nodded once. Then don't. Grace blinked, surprised by the simplicity of it. Luca's voice lowered. But don't pretend it didn't shape you. Grace swallowed. Because it had shaped her. It had shaped how she cleaned other people's messes before they could see them. It had shaped how she apologized too fast, smiled too politely, tried too hard to be worth keeping. Luca watched her, eyes steady, and said quietly, You don't have to earn safety with me. Grace's breath caught. That was the kind of sentence she'd never heard in her life. Grace whispered, Why are you like this tonight? Luca's mouth twitched. Because you asked for normal. Grace frowned. This isn't normal. Luca leaned closer, voice low. It's honest. Grace's heartbeat sped up. Luca's hand moved across the table slowly, palm up. An invitation, not a command. Grace stared at his hand. Then she placed her fingers into his. His hand closed gently around hers, warm and steady. Grace's body softened without permission. Luca's voice was quiet. You feel it too? Grace didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her hand was in his and she wasn't pulling away. The food arrived. They ate. They talked. And somehow, Luca Conti made it feel easy. He asked questions, listened, remembered small details. He was dryly funny in a way that caught Grace off guard. At one point, Grace teased him about how he walked into rooms like everyone owed him rent. Luca's mouth twitched again. They do. Grace laughed, then covered her mouth. I can't believe you just said that. Luca leaned closer, eyes warm. You're the one who said I'm intimidating. Grace's cheeks warmed. You are. Luca's gaze dropped to her lips for half a second, then returned to her eyes. Good. Grace's breath shortened. After dinner, Luca walked her outside. The city air was cold, but Luca's coat brushed her arm, and the contact made her feel warm anyway. They stopped on the sidewalk. Luca turned toward her fully. May I kiss you? Grace's pulse hammered. She'd expected Luca to just take what he wanted. The fact that he asked made her knees feel weak. Grace whispered, Yes. Luca's hand lifted to her cheek slowly, fingers warm against her skin. Then he kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't aggressive. It was controlled in the way Luca was controlled, but it was still full of heat. Grace's hands lifted automatically, one resting against his chest again, the other sliding into his coat. Luca deepened the kiss slightly, then pulled back just enough to look at her. His eyes were darker now, his breathing steady but heavier. Grace's lips parted as she exhaled. That wasn't a business meeting. Luca's mouth twitched. No. Grace's chest rose and fell fast. So what are we doing? Luca leaned in again, close enough to make Grace's stomach flip. We're doing the thing you pretended you didn't want. Grace swallowed. And what is that? Luca's voice was low. Letting someone see you. Grace's eyes stung unexpectedly. She hated that he could make her feel exposed with one sentence. Grace took a step back, forcing herself to breathe. You still haven't told me about your mother. Luca's expression sharpened slightly, like the topic carried weight he didn't want tonight. Grace held his gaze. You said tonight. Luca was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Come with me." Grace blinked. "Where?" Luca's voice stayed calm. "To my office downstairs. There's something I need to show you." Grace's stomach tightened, because Luca's office was where decisions got made. And whatever he was about to show her felt like the opposite of normal. And the question was clear. What was waiting in Luca's office that he couldn't say at dinner? And how far back did his mother's connection to Grace really go? Luca's office at night felt different. In the day, it was clean and sharp and controlled. People in and out, phones ringing, Victor appearing silently with updates. At night, it was quiet in a way that made Grace's footsteps sound too loud. Luca walked ahead, opened the door, and let her in first. Grace stepped inside and stopped. On Luca's desk, perfectly centered, was a thin envelope. No logo, no stamp, just her name, Grace Harper. Grace's chest tightened. "That's for me?" Luca stood behind her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Yes." Grace stared at the envelope like it might bite. "From who?" Luca's voice was calm but serious. "My mother." Grace turned slowly. "Your mother is gone." Luca nodded. "She wrote it before she died. She told my attorney to give it to me if certain things happened." Grace's throat tightened. "What things?" Luca's gaze held hers. "If you ever tried to leave." Grace felt cold ripple down her spine. "Leave?" Luca stepped closer. "Grace, look at me." Grace forced herself to meet his eyes. Luca's voice came out steady. "I didn't plan for you to fall into my life like this, but my mother did." Grace whispered, "That makes no sense." Luca's expression softened slightly. "Open it." Grace's fingers trembled as she picked up the envelope. Her name written in neat handwriting. Grace swallowed hard and slid a finger under the seal. The paper inside was folded once. Grace unfolded it slowly. And then she read. Grace's eyes moved across the lines and her breath shortened. Because the letter wasn't formal. It wasn't businesslike. It was personal. It spoke about a young girl, Grace, years ago. A girl Luca's mother had met in Pennsylvania during a charity visit tied to an adoption agency. Grace's hands started to shake. Grace whispered, "No." Luca watched her carefully. "You remember?" Grace swallowed hard. "I remember a woman who brought stuffed animals, who sat with me and talked to me like I mattered." Luca nodded once. "That was her." Grace's vision blurred. "Why would she?" Grace looked down again, reading the next lines. The letter said Luca's mother had seen something in Grace. Strength, quiet stubbornness, a refusal to give up. It said she'd told Luca about her. Not as a project, not as charity, as someone who deserved a safe place if the world ever cornered her again. Grace's chest hurt. Her throat tightened until breathing felt difficult. Grace whispered, "I didn't know it was her." Luca's voice was low. "She didn't tell you because she didn't want you to feel owned." Grace flinched at that word. "Owned." Grace whispered, "So you hired me because of this letter?" Luca nodded slowly. "Yes." Grace's hands shook harder. "And you kept me here because—" Luca's voice stayed controlled. "Because I didn't want you to disappear." Grace looked up sharply. "That's not a good reason." Luca didn't deny it. "I know." Grace stared at him, torn. Because part of her felt grateful, and part of her felt trapped. Grace forced a steady breath. "Did you plan the blind date?" Luca's eyes narrowed. "No." Grace searched his face for lies. Luca added, calm, "Natalie did that. I didn't know until I saw you." Grace's shoulders loosened slightly. Then she realized something else. Grace's voice was quiet. "So your mother wanted me safe?" Luca nodded. "Yes." Grace whispered. "And you?" Luca didn't move. "And me what?" Grace's heart hammered. Did she want this? Luca was silent for a long moment. Then he took a slow breath. "My mother wanted me to learn how to love someone without controlling them." Grace stared at him. That honesty landed in her chest like a weight. Luca's gaze stayed locked on hers. She knew I'd struggle. Grace's voice shook. And what if I struggle too? Luca stepped closer, careful. Then we struggled together. Grace's eyes stung. She hated that those words made her feel safe. Hated it because it meant she wanted it. Grace lowered the letter slowly. I need air. Luca nodded immediately. Okay. Grace blinked, surprised. That's it? Luca's voice stayed calm. Yes. You said you need air. So you get air. Grace swallowed. He was trying. Grace turned and walked out of the office, moving toward the terrace. The terrace door opened to cold air and city lights. Grace stepped outside, gripping the railing with both hands. Her breathing came fast. Behind her, Luca stepped out quietly, staying a respectful distance away. Grace stared at the city, voice tight. I don't like feeling like I was planned. Luca's voice was gentle. You weren't planned like a possession. You were hoped for. Grace laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. That doesn't make it easier. Luca nodded. I know. Grace turned slightly, looking at him. Do you want me because you're supposed to? Luca's expression sharpened. No. Grace watched him carefully. Luca stepped closer, eyes intense, voice low. I want you because you walk into my life and everything feels different. Because you don't flatter me. Because you don't fear me the way people pretend not to. Grace swallowed. I do fear you sometimes. Luca didn't flinch. Good. That keeps you honest. Grace exhaled. The air between them felt heavy again. Grace whispered, Ethan is going to ask to see me again. Luca's jaw tightened slightly. And you'll decide what you want. Grace stared at him. You're actually letting me. Luca's mouth twitched. I'm trying. Grace's throat tightened. I don't want to hurt him. Luca nodded once. Then don't. Be clear. Grace's eyes dropped. I've never been good at that. Luca stepped closer, and this time his hand lifted, slow, careful, and rested lightly on Grace's shoulder. Grace didn't flinch. She leaned into the warmth without meaning to. Luca's voice was quiet. You're good at more than you know. Grace turned her head slightly, looking up at him. His face was close. His eyes were warm and serious at the same time. Grace whispered, If this keeps going, it becomes real. Luca's voice dropped. It already is. Grace's breath caught. Luca leaned in and kissed her again, gentle, slow, full of heat that made Grace's knees feel weak. Grace's hands slid up into his coat, gripping him lightly. Luca pulled back, just enough to speak against her lips. Come away with me this weekend. Grace blinked. What? Luca's eyes held hers. 2 days. No staff, no meetings, no strangers watching you. Just us. Grace's heart pounded. She should say no. It was too fast. But she also felt something she'd never felt before. The idea of being chosen, not used. Grace swallowed. And Ethan? Luca's jaw tightened slightly. Grace, don't make me compete. Grace whispered, I'm not trying to. Luca's gaze softened. Then come with me. Grace hesitated, and in that hesitation her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out without thinking. Ethan, I'm in your neighborhood tomorrow. Coffee? I promise. Zero drama. Grace stared at the message, pulse jumping. Luca's eyes flicked to her phone. He didn't ask. He didn't demand. He just watched her, quiet, waiting. Grace's chest tightened, because now she had a choice, and choices were scarier than rules. And the tension tightened. Would Grace meet Ethan and risk confusion, or choose Luca's weekend escape and make real unavoidable? Grace met Ethan for coffee. Not because she wanted romance with him, because she needed closure without being cruel. She chose a public cafe in daylight, simple and safe. She told Victor where she'd be before she could talk herself out of it. Victor didn't comment. He only said, "Thank you." That "thank you" made Grace's stomach twist. It felt like proof Luca had been right about safety. Ethan arrived with a warm smile, holding 2 coffees like he'd already guessed what she'd order. Vanilla latte, he said, offering it. I remembered. Grace blinked. We ordered wine. Ethan shrugged. You mentioned vanilla when you looked at dessert. Grace exhaled a small laugh. That's observant. Ethan sat across from her, relaxed, not pushing. So, are you okay? Grace held the cup in both hands, letting the warmth steady her. I'm okay. I'm sorry I left like that. Ethan waved it off. You didn't leave. You got pulled. Grace's cheeks warmed. He didn't force me. Ethan's expression turned careful. He didn't have to. That's the thing. Grace swallowed. Ethan leaned forward slightly, voice gentle. Grace, I'm not here to fight for you like a movie. I'm here to make sure you're choosing your life. Grace's chest tightened. I am. Ethan nodded. Then tell me. Grace took a slow breath. I like him. Ethan's smile faded, but he didn't look angry. He looked resigned. He nodded once. I figured. Grace whispered, You're a good man. Ethan smiled faintly. That sounds like the sentence people use when they're letting someone down gently. Grace winced. I'm not trying to. Ethan held up a hand. It's okay. I don't want you if you're not fully free to want me. Grace stared at him. Fully free. Ethan's gaze stayed steady. You work for him, Grace. You live in his world. You know that matters. Grace's throat tightened. He promised it wouldn't affect my job. Ethan nodded. And I hope he means it. Grace hesitated, then asked, Why did you agree to the blind date? Ethan blinked. Because Natalie said you were great. Grace narrowed her eyes slightly. That's not the whole reason. Ethan paused. Then he exhaled slowly. Okay. Fine. You're too sharp. Grace waited. Ethan leaned back, rubbing the back of his neck like he was choosing how much to say. Because I recognized your name. Grace froze. What? Ethan's gaze stayed gentle. Not from Luca, not from tabloids. From a file. Grace's stomach dropped. A file? Ethan nodded slowly. I volunteer sometimes with a foundation that helps adults who grew up in foster care. I saw your name in a donor-connected record years ago. Grace's hands tightened around her cup. I never donated anything. I barely... Ethan shook his head quickly. Not you donating. Someone donating in your name. Grace's breath caught. Her mind flashed back to the letter. Luca's mother. Grace whispered. It was her. Ethan nodded. I didn't know who she was then. I only knew someone had been quietly funding support services tied to your case. Grace stared, stunned. Ethan continued, softer now. When Natalie told me your last name, I thought, maybe it's the same Grace, and it was. Grace's chest hurt. So you went on a date with me because you felt sorry for me? Ethan's eyes widened. No. Grace, no. Grace's voice shook. Then why? Ethan leaned forward, voice gentle but firm. Because when I saw that file, I remember thinking, whoever she is, she survived something heavy. And she deserves something light. Grace stared at him, eyes burning. Ethan added, and when Natalie showed me your picture, I thought you were beautiful. So yes, I was curious, but not out of pity. Grace swallowed. She believed him. That made it harder. Grace whispered, I don't want to be someone's project. Ethan nodded. Neither do I. That's why I'm telling you the truth. Grace's throat tightened. Thank you. Ethan smiled faintly, then looked down at his cup. So that's it. Grace nodded slowly. I think so. Ethan took a slow breath. Then here's my last truth. Grace looked up. Okay. Ethan's gaze held hers. Luca Conti isn't just a strict employer. He's a man with a lot of power, and power can make people lazy about consent. Grace stiffened. He asked before he kissed me. Ethan nodded. Good. That matters. Grace waited, tense. Ethan continued, calm. But asking once isn't the same as honoring you always. So if he ever stops asking, if he ever makes you feel like you can't say no, call me. Grace stared at him, surprised. Why would you? Ethan shrugged lightly, trying to smile. Because I'd rather be the guy you didn't choose than the guy who didn't protect you when it counted. Grace's eyes stung. She swallowed hard. You're going to make me cry in a cafe. Ethan smiled. Sorry, I'm dramatic. I warned you. Grace laughed through the tightness in her throat. Then she nodded once. Okay, I will. Ethan stood. And Grace? Grace looked up. Ethan smiled gently. Choose yourself, even if it means choosing him. Grace nodded, heart pounding. They parted kindly. No bitterness, no scene. When Grace stepped outside, the cold air hit her face, and the first thing she saw was Luca's car across the street, not pulling up, not blocking her, just there, watching from a respectful distance. Grace's chest tightened, because Luca said he wouldn't control her, and he wasn't, but he still couldn't stay away. Grace walked toward the car. The driver didn't open the door until Grace reached it. Then it opened smoothly. Inside, Luca sat quiet, posture controlled, eyes focused. He didn't ask what Ethan said. He didn't demand proof. He simply said, low, "Are you okay?" Grace blinked. That question, real, simple, hit harder than any jealousy. Grace nodded. Yes. Luca's jaw flexed. Did he touch you? Grace stared at him. Luca. Luca exhaled, eyes closing for half a second. Sorry. Grace's chest softened a little. No, he didn't. He was respectful. Luca nodded once. Good. Grace hesitated, then said, He knew my name from a file. Luca's eyes sharpened. What file? Grace swallowed. A foundation file. He volunteers. He recognized me. Luca's face went still. Grace watched him. You didn't know that. Luca's voice was controlled. No. Grace's pulse jumped. Then someone else has been tracking me. Luca's gaze hardened. Yes. Grace whispered. Who? Luca was silent for a long moment. Then he said, quiet and precise, My uncle. Grace's stomach dropped. Your uncle? Luca's jaw tightened. He handled some of my mother's affairs. He disagreed with her choices. He believes loyalty is bought, not earned. Grace's throat tightened. And he's been watching me? Luca's voice stayed calm, but sharp. He's been deciding if you're useful. Grace felt cold ripple down her spine. Useful for what? Luca's gaze held hers. For me. Grace stared. What does that mean? Luca's expression didn't soften. It means my uncle doesn't like that you matter to me. Grace's heart hammered. So what happens now? Luca leaned slightly closer, voice low. Now you come with me this weekend. We leave the city. We breathe. And when we come back, I end it. Grace blinked. And what? Luca's eyes stayed intense. My uncle's access, his opinions, his influence. Grace whispered, That sounds dangerous. Luca's voice stayed controlled. I won't let it be. Grace swallowed hard. And if I say no? Luca's gaze didn't flinch. Then I respect it, and I still end it. Grace stared at him, shaken, because he wasn't threatening. He was choosing. Grace whispered, Luca, why do you want me so badly? Luca's voice dropped to something raw. Because when you look at me like you're not afraid, I remember I'm human. Grace's breath caught. She didn't have a perfect response. So she did the only honest thing. Grace reached out and took his hand. Luca's fingers tightened around hers, warm and steady. Grace whispered, Take me away this weekend. Luca's eyes darkened slightly. Yes. Grace's heart pounded. Then Luca added, quiet but serious. And Grace? Grace looked at him. What? Luca's gaze held hers. There's one more truth I haven't told you. Grace's stomach tightened. What truth? Luca's voice was low. The night you showed up at my door. It wasn't an accident. Grace froze. And the tension snapped tight. If Grace arriving at Luca's door wasn't an accident, who arranged it? And did Luca know the whole time? Grace didn't speak on the drive out of the city, not because she was angry, because her mind wouldn't stop replaying Luca's words. The night you showed up at my door, it wasn't an accident. When the car finally pulled into a quiet coastal property, clean, modern, private, Grace felt like she was stepping into a different life. No city noise, no staff hovering, no polished marble halls, just open space, soft light, and Luca standing beside her like he didn't know how to be anything other than careful. Inside the house, Grace set her bag down and turned immediately. "Tell me," she said. Luca didn't pretend not to understand. "Now?" "Yes," Grace said, voice steady. "No more half-truths." Luca took a slow breath, then nodded. "Okay." Grace crossed her arms, holding herself together. "Who arranged it?" Luca's gaze stayed on her face. "My mother." Grace froze. "Your mother arranged me showing up at your door?" Luca nodded once. "She didn't force you, she didn't drag you, but she made sure you had my address and my number." Grace's throat tightened. "How?" Luca's voice stayed calm. "Natalie." Grace blinked hard. "Natalie?" Luca nodded again. "My mother knew Natalie's aunt. Natalie didn't know it was connected to me. She only knew someone had asked her to help you if you ever needed work in the city." Grace's chest tightened. "So Natalie has been part of this the whole time." Luca's voice softened. "Not knowingly." Grace's hands trembled slightly. "So my life has been guided." Luca stepped closer, cautious. Grace snapped. "Did you know when I showed up?" Luca didn't hesitate. "No." Grace stared at him. "Don't lie." Luca's eyes stayed steady. "I'm not. I didn't know until months later, when my attorney told me the letter existed." Grace swallowed, shaken. Luca's voice was quiet. "I thought you were a woman who needed work. I thought you were capable. I thought you were different." Grace's chest tightened. "Different how?" Luca's gaze held hers. "You didn't flatter me. You didn't stare at my money. You didn't act scared just to get what you wanted." Grace swallowed, feeling exposed. Luca stepped closer again. "And then I started caring." Grace's voice shook. "So this was always—" "No," Luca said firmly. "It wasn't always this. It became this because of you." Grace stared at him, trying to hold on to anger. But anger didn't fit perfectly anymore, because Luca looked sincere, tired, honest, almost nervous. Grace whispered, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Luca exhaled slowly. "Because I didn't want you to think your choices weren't yours." Grace's throat tightened. "But they weren't." Luca shook his head. "Grace, you still chose to knock on my door. You still chose to stay. You still chose to go on that blind date. You still chose to come here." Grace's eyes stung. Because he was right. And she hated that both things could be true at once. She had agency, and there were invisible hands around her life anyway. Grace turned away, pacing 2 steps, then stopped. She pressed her hand to her forehead. "I don't know how to feel." Luca's voice was gentle. "Then feel one thing at a time." Grace laughed once, strained. "You're trying to sound like a normal boyfriend now." Luca's mouth twitched. "I'm learning." Grace turned back to him. "And your uncle." Luca's face hardened slightly. "He won't touch your life again." Grace's voice tightened. "How can you promise that?" Luca's gaze stayed steady. "Because I already handled it." Grace blinked. "Already?" Luca nodded. "Before we left, I removed his access to my mother's accounts. I removed him from the foundation board. I cut him out of anything that touches you." Grace stared at him, stunned. "You did that? For me?" Luca's voice dropped. "Yes." Grace whispered. "That's a lot." Luca stepped closer, eyes intense. "You're a lot." Grace's breath caught. Luca's hand lifted, slow and careful. He touched Grace's cheek gently, thumb warm against her skin. Grace didn't pull away. Luca's voice was quiet. "If you want to leave, I'll take you back right now. No punishment. No coldness. No games." Grace stared at him, heart pounding. And if I stay? Luca's gaze darkened slightly. Then I stop pretending this is small. Grace's breath shortened. Grace whispered, "Show me what you mean." Luca's eyes searched her face one last time like he was checking for fear. Grace didn't give him fear. So Luca kissed her. Not rushed, not controlled like before. Still respectful, still careful, but full of the truth he'd been holding back. Grace's hand slid into his shirt, gripping him lightly. Luca's arms wrapped around her, firm, warm, secure, pulling her close enough that Grace felt his heartbeat against her. They broke apart only to breathe. Grace's cheeks were warm, lips tingling. Luca's voice came out low. "You're not my maid tonight." Grace blinked. "What am I?" Luca held her gaze. "You're Grace." Grace laughed softly, breathless. "That's not an answer." Luca's mouth twitched. "It's the only one that matters." They spent the night in a way that felt private and safe. Slow touches, quiet laughter, Luca making food badly and pretending he didn't. At one point he tried to crack an egg and got shell in the bowl. Grace stared at it, amused. "You run entire industries." Luca shrugged, dead serious. "Eggs are unpredictable." Grace laughed so hard she had to lean on the counter. Luca watched her laugh like it fed him. Later they sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, the room dim. Grace rested her head against Luca's shoulder. Luca's hand moved slowly over her arm, warm, steady, like he couldn't stop touching her now that he was allowed. Grace whispered, "I don't want to go back to being careful all the time." Luca kissed her hair. "Then don't." Grace looked up. "It's not that simple." Luca's voice stayed calm. "I can make it simpler." Grace frowned. "How?" Luca took a slow breath. "Come work with me publicly." Grace blinked. "Publicly?" Luca nodded. "Not as staff, as my partner." Grace sat up, stunned. "Partner?" Luca's gaze was steady, serious. "In my legitimate business side. Operations, hospitality, real estate. Whatever you want to learn, I'll put you in rooms where people listen to you." Grace's throat tightened. "People won't listen to me." Luca's eyes didn't flinch. "They will, when I say they will." Grace stared at him. "That sounds like control again." Luca nodded slowly. "It is influence, but it's influence used for you, not on you." Grace swallowed, overwhelmed. "Why?" Luca's voice dropped. "Because I'm not keeping you in a back hallway, and I'm not hiding you." Grace's eyes stung. "Luca?" Luca shifted slightly, then reached into his pocket. Grace froze when she saw the small box. Her breath caught immediately. Luca didn't open it yet. He just held it. Grace whispered, "No." Luca's voice was low. "Yes." Grace's chest tightened. "It's too fast." Luca nodded. "Then I won't rush you." Grace stared at him, stunned again. "What?" Luca opened the box anyway, but inside wasn't a huge ring meant to shock her. It was simple, elegant. A thin band with a small stone that caught the light softly. Luca's voice was quiet. "This isn't a trap. It's a question." Grace's heart hammered. "What question?" Luca held her gaze. "Will you be mine by choice?" Grace's eyes filled. She swallowed hard. "You're giving me the choice." Luca nodded once. "Always." Grace stared at the ring, then at him. She thought about the letter, the foundation, the invisible hands. And then she thought about the very visible man in front of her, asking instead of taking, listening instead of ordering, trying instead of assuming. Grace whispered, "Yes." Luca's breath released like he'd been holding it for years. He slid the ring onto her finger slowly, reverently. Then he kissed her hand. Then he kissed her mouth, deeper this time, as if the yes changed something in the air. Grace laughed softly through the kiss. "You look relieved." Luca pulled back, eyes warm. "I am." Grace rested her forehead against his. "What happens when we go back?" Luca's voice was steady. "We live the truth." Grace whispered, "And Ethan?" Luca's jaw tightened slightly, then softened. He'll be fine, and if he's smart, he'll stay kind. Grace smiled faintly. He is kind. Luca nodded. I know. Grace blinked. You know? Luca's mouth twitched. I know because you chose me anyway. Grace's chest tightened. They stayed in that quiet for a moment. Warm, close, safe. Then Luca's phone buzzed on the table. Luca glanced at it once, then turned it face down without reading. Grace raised an eyebrow. Who was that? Luca's eyes stayed on hers. Not more important than you. Grace's cheeks warmed. That was smooth. Luca's mouth twitched. I practice. Grace laughed, then softened. Luca, are we really going to be happy? Luca's gaze held hers, steady and sure. Yes? Grace swallowed. How do you know? Luca's hand slid to her cheek again, thumb warm. Because I'm not letting this become complicated by fear. Grace's breath caught. Luca added, quieter. And because you're not alone anymore. Grace's eyes stung. She whispered, I said that first. Luca kissed her gently. You did. Grace looked down at the ring, then back at him. And even with a future full of unknowns, one thing was painfully clear. Grace Harper wasn't waiting to be chosen anymore. She already was. By the one man who finally learned how to ask. Luca's lips brushed her ear as he whispered, half teasing, half serious. So, do you want to tell Natalie now, or do we let her panic for a few hours? Grace laughed, breathless, and the sound filled the quiet house like a promise. Happy, real, and the last playful question. Do they announce it immediately? Or enjoy one more secret night before the world finds out? Grace Harper didn't wake up to an alarm anymore. She woke up to quiet sunlight and the warmth of Luca Conti's hand resting over hers like it belonged there, because now it did. No rushing footsteps in a staff hallway. No tight knot in her stomach wondering if she was about to be questioned, tested, or watched. Just calm, just real. And the softest part was this. Luca didn't try to own her peace. He protected it by honoring it. The ring on her finger still surprised her sometimes. Not because it was big or flashy, but because it meant something simple. She'd been chosen in a way that didn't shrink her. Luca had asked. Grace had said yes, and after that, he had treated her yes like a promise, not a prize. The first person to find out was Natalie. Grace had called her in the kitchen trying to sound casual, trying to keep the excitement from shaking her voice. Natalie didn't allow it. The second Grace said the words, Natalie screamed so loudly that Grace had to pull the phone away from her ear and laugh. Then Natalie demanded proof, demanded details, demanded a time and date for a celebration, and then immediately started crying like Grace had just told her she'd won the lottery of love. You better not let him scare you. Natalie had warned through happy tears, as if Luca could hear her through the phone. Grace had looked across the room at Luca, who was pretending to read emails while watching her with that calm, possessive focus. Grace had smiled and said, He doesn't scare me. He listens. That was the part Natalie didn't expect. Luca Conti, the man who made whole rooms go silent, had become the man who lowered his voice when Grace looked tired, the man who asked before he touched, the man who made breakfast badly and refused to admit it, then let Grace fix it while he kissed her neck and whispered that she was too good at saving him. Because Luca didn't want a maid anymore. He wanted Grace. Fully. Publicly. And he made that clear in ways that weren't about showing off. He didn't announce her like a trophy. He introduced her like a partner. At the first formal event after the weekend away, people tried to figure out what Grace was to him. Staff, girlfriend, something in between. Luca didn't give them room to guess. He stood beside her, his hand warm at the small of her back, and when someone spoke down to her, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply redirected the conversation toward Grace and waited until they addressed her properly. Then he smiled at her, quiet and approving, like he'd just watched her win something she didn't even know she was allowed to win. Grace learned quickly that Luca's world didn't have to swallow her. She could reshape it. Her days changed. She still had that natural gift for order, for seeing what needed to be handled before anyone else noticed. But now she wasn't doing it to stay invisible. She was doing it because she was good at it, and she was finally being seen for it. Luca backed it up with action. He set her up with a real title in his legitimate business side, with responsibilities that matched her brain, not her old job. He made sure her pay reflected her value. He made sure she had boundaries that everyone respected. And when she doubted herself, Luca didn't fill her head with sweet lies. He reminded her of facts. You're smart. You're steady. You're mine by choice. And you're not going back to a life where people act like you should be grateful for crumbs. Even Ethan got closure. Grace met him one last time for coffee and thanked him for being kind when it would have been easier to be bitter. Ethan smiled, told her she looked brighter, and admitted he'd never stood a chance against the way Luca looked at her. Then he gave her a simple, honest wish, that she would never shrink again. Grace promised she wouldn't, and she meant it. Weeks later, Luca took Grace back to that first luxury restaurant, not to control the story, to rewrite it with her. Same room, same kind of table, same soft music. But this time Grace didn't feel like a woman being watched. She felt like a woman adored. Luca arrived without drama, slid into the seat beside her instead of across, and leaned in close with that quiet heat that still made her body wake up. "You said you weren't alone," he murmured. Grace smiled, resting her hand on his thigh under the table like she owned the moment. "I wasn't." Luca kissed the side of her neck, quick, private, enough to make her breath catch. "Good," he said, "because I'm not letting you be alone again." Grace turned her face toward him, eyes shining. "That sounds like a promise." Luca's mouth curved in that rare, devastating smile. "It is." And later, when they went home, their home now, Luca took her hand in the elevator the way he always did, like he was still amazed that she'd chosen him. Grace squeezed his fingers and leaned into him. The city lights flickered beyond the glass. The world kept spinning, but inside that quiet, controlled space, Grace Harper knew something for the first time in her life without needing to argue with it. Love didn't have to feel like survival. With Luca, it felt like safety, and desire, and laughter, and a future she actually wanted to wake up in. And as the elevator doors opened, Luca leaned close and whispered, half teasing, half serious, "So, are we telling Natalie the wedding date tonight?" Grace laughed, breathless, and turned her face into his chest. "Or are we letting her panic a little longer?"